Hello, and welcome back to Drug Cultures. Today we're going to be doing something a little different than what we've done in previous episodes. Now, I have been wanting to get some guests on the show for a while now, and today I am so happy to say that it is finally happening. The majority of this episode is going to be a conversation with Jonathan Maxwell Stanaford, who goes by Max and is the founder of a church in Portland, Oregon called Raven of the Sacred Entheogen. Raven of the Sacred Entheogen is a bit different than most other churches. It is non-denominational by design, and unlike, say, the communion wine of the Catholic Church, its sacrament is psilocybe cubensis, known colloquially as magic mushrooms. I've heard about psychedelic churches before, and have even dedicated a whole episode of this show to the topic of the oldest one of these churches, the Native American Church of North America. That's episode 5, Peyote Through the Centuries, if you're interested in learning more. But as a quick summary, the Native American Church was incorporated over 100 years ago by a confederation of tribes in Oklahoma, who did so to protect their right to use peyote as a sacrament in their religious practice. In the coming decades, the church spread across the country and into Canada as well, adopted by a number of First Nations peoples. The history of peyote in North America is intricately tied to the genocide of its indigenous inhabitants. But the history of the church is more complicated, and at times quite triumphant, protecting the right of tribal nations to worship peyote as a sacrament, even as it became a federally criminalized plant under the Controlled Substances Act. In 1993, President Bill Clinton signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act into law, which strengthened protections for religious organizations who might, in any other circumstance, be breaking federal law. The bill states that government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability. Basically, even a law that is not specifically intended to prohibit the free exercise of religion might somehow have that as an unintended or ancillary effect. This piece of legislation suddenly made it easier for religious organizations to mount a legal defense of their ceremonial use of psychedelics. And in the first decade of the 2000s, multiple churches did exactly that. In 2006, the United States Supreme Court granted the Ayahuasca Church UDV the legal authority to import ayahuasca from Brazil for its ceremonies, despite ayahuasca containing the Schedule I controlled substance DMT. In 2009, a district court judge granted another ayahuasca-based church, Santo Daime, similar protections, citing the 2006 Supreme Court decision. Since then, a number of similar psychedelic religious organizations have popped up, including a Denver-based temple called Sacred Tribe that claims to practice a type of psychedelic-influenced Kabbalistic Judaism. So, imagine my surprise when I was at an open mic comedy night a few weeks ago, which I do sometimes, it's why I'm so charming and personable, and the guy performing right after me starts talking about how he runs a mushroom church right here in Portland, Oregon. I got to talking with Max and quickly realized that not only was he the real deal, and that his church was the first of its kind in the state of Oregon, but that he was eager to come on my podcast and get the word out to as many people as possible. In our conversation, which you're about to hear, we cover a wide-ranging array of topics. I ask him a lot of questions about the history of the church, which is now legally incorporated as a 508c1a faith-based organization and thus fully protected by the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But we also talk about his absolutely wild backstory, his childhood as the son of a drug runner for the Mexican cartels, his personal experiences with psychoactive substances, and how he developed his own religious beliefs. Perhaps most interesting to me is the conversation we had about class. He sees his church as an alternative to the therapeutic model of psychedelic use, one that will not be prohibitively expensive for poor, working class, and middle class people to access. He also gifted me a copy of his book, The Mindful Mycologist, which I highly recommend you all check out. And if you're in the Portland area and want to learn more about the church, You can learn more on his website, ravenofthesacredentheogen.com. That last word is entheogen, which just means a plant that is capable of inducing a spiritual experience. Anyway, without further ado, I'm Sky Hawthorne, this is Drug Cultures, and please enjoy this conversation with Max from Raven of the Sacred Entheogen. All right, we are live with Jonathan Maxwell Stanaford, aka Max. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sky. It's really nice to be here with you.
So I met this guy at an open mic. We both do open mic comedy, and started talking about being a part of a mushroom church. And I was like, I've heard of mushroom churches. This is ringing a bell for me. I didn't know there was one in Portland. So tell me a little bit about, however you want to go with this question, about your journey, where you started, and how you got to forming a mushroom church in Portland, Oregon.
I think that the place to start would be with our lawyer, and her name is Amy Margolis, and she's a local weed lawyer. She's really big in the weed industry, and she has a lot of clout, and at least according to her, I actually didn't verify this, she was part of the team that won the ayahuasca case, which set the precedence for churches that weren't of an indigenous origin. And so when we contacted Amy, which was, I think it was about 3 years ago to the date yesterday, we contacted Amy, and she was like, I can't believe you're the first person approaching me about this. And so what Amy did was give us a roadmap to legality, where there's a lot of churches that have tried to do this, but they didn't follow the actual specific steps that the feds want to hear very specific things in order to give you your map to legality. And so Amy gave that to us. It did cost us quite a bit of money, but I thank her very much for giving us that roadmap, because now we are, as far as I know, officially Oregon's first mushroom church.
So talk about that roadmap to legality. What does that look like?
One of the biggest things is that it actually had to do with, it needs to be completely about spirituality and not about healing and healthcare. So one of the things we've specifically avoided is words that might seem medical or things that might say healing without having the word spiritual directly attached to it.
That's really interesting, because that, I mean, listeners who pay attention to this stuff probably know about Measure 109. Measure 110, which was the decriminalization of all drugs, that got a lot of national attention here in Oregon, got a lot of negative publicity. Measure 109 was in the same legislative session, passed in 2020, but that one didn't get quite as much attention. That was the therapeutic use of psilocybin. That Oregon legalized psilocybin for therapeutic uses, but that's different than what you do. Talk a little bit about...
We actually cross a few similar lines, and so one of the things is that I want to say is I did vote for that because I believe in the work that they're doing. But one of the areas that I thought was kind of flawed is that it's really only going to be for people that are wealthy and kind of an elite class. And so one of the things that always hits me on point is when they're doing these therapeutic sessions, what they're looking for, and this happens in like the huge clinical trials with cancer patients, the people who have the most profound mystical experience are the ones who actually have it's for the people who are afraid of dying. And they come out of it, if they have a mystical experience, they're most likely no longer afraid of dying. And so when you hear the term mystical experience, like that is kind of the realm of religion. And therapeutically, they're really operating in the same area. But I feel personally that it specifically being so expensive and for an elite class, that through the church, we can provide very similar things and make it accessible to my people. I grew up poor.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought up class, because that was something I was going to ask you about. Do you feel like, because one of the big things that I kind of rail against on this podcast is this sort of anti-politics that seems to pervade the psychedelic space. This sense of, if you take psychedelics, that the work of psychedelic healing or being on a psychedelic journey somehow makes you transcend left and right, etc., etc. And I think there's some truth to that. I think everybody, regardless of your political affiliation, has something to gain from psychedelics. But I also think there's this real important things that are political topics that affect psychedelics directly and are affected by it that often aren't talked about in the space. And one of them is class. How do you access these medicines? What if you can't afford them? You know, your interests, the things you're going to need in your life are just dramatically different if you have money versus if you don't have money. So talk about how growing up poor, how did that shape what you wanted to bring to the church, and what do you notice in terms of sort of the class makeup of the people who are getting involved with this?
Wow, that is a really, really big question. So I'm gonna have to take that in steps. Let's start with I grew up poor. My mother, when I was a kid, up until I was about 6, she was actually a drug runner for the Mexican cartel, and up until that point, I actually thought we were rich. And like we had a home in Southern California, and we had we had a butler, and we had a maid, and we had a hot tub and a nice yard. And then the cartel went belly up, and my mom ran, and we ran to Utah where our family lived. And at that point, she became a social worker and spent the rest of her life actually putting child molesters in jail, which was amazing, amazing work. And so I got a perspective of class of kind of both sides, where until I was 6, I thought we were rich, and then I realized the rest of my life we were actually poor. And I think that was a really good way to get the contrast of the two sides. But approaching this therapeutic session, the idea with that same thing, it's all about accessibility. And right now, there's a huge wait list for all of these places, and they're booked up, and it's...
By these places, you're talking about the therapeutic...
Yes, thank you for the clarification.
Psilocybin therapy centers, right?
That's exactly. By the therapeutic centers, it's really only accessible to people who have a lot of money, and there's no way that insurance is going to pay for these things anytime soon. And so the accessibility there is, when I say my people, I'm talking about people after I was 6, when I realized we were poor. These are people that are never going to have accessibility to these modalities. And so personally, one of the missions of the church is long-term is to be able to make sure that my people are getting accessibility to these modalities just the same.
I think that's a really beautiful, beautiful sentiment. Before we move on, did you grow up in Mexico?
No. I grew up in Southern California.
You were just sort of on this side of the border, the receiving end. Your mom.
So these are things that my mother didn't tell me until we used to do road trips when I was 15, and all of a sudden I got full disclosure. And so it was actually really interesting to figure out those things that happened in my early life and actually get the whole story with full disclosure.
This was years after your mom had left the industry.
Yes, I was 6 when she left the industry. I was 15 when she told me about it.
That is just such a wild... Sorry, 1 second. That is just such a wild upbringing to have had. Do you feel like, if you don't mind me asking, like, what's your personal experience with these substances? And do you feel like having a mom who was involved in this industry at all, in drugs, do you think that has any relation?
I did have something to add on the front side of your question. When the very first time I took LSD, it actually made me a better person. And it teaches you about love in a way that, I grew up in a really tough town where it was kind of dog eat dog, and you had to play the role of that tough guy in order to survive. And so I was just playing the role of that tough guy in order to survive when I got my first dose of LSD. And all of a sudden, I realized that, it's okay to love, and it's okay to hug your male friends without appearing gay. And it really did change me as a person and shape me into a better person. And I think that's one of the things that psychedelics does, is make you look at how ridiculous machismo is, or make you look at how ridiculous, the universe can be just in general. And it can help you jump right to this is about love. And I think it can be very profound. A couple of the other experiences I had was we lived in Klamath Falls, Oregon, when my formative years. And it was a town filled with drugs. And in our youth, we were ready to try them all. And one of the greatest things that I got to do was do all the drugs before I had enough money to ruin my life with them. And so in doing that, I did heroin and I smoked methamphetamine, and it was actually a pretty profound experience to have learned that these drugs are evil before, like I said, I had enough money to ruin my life with them.
What was your experience in terms of, like, how did you realize they were evil?
Because I went to a party once, and I was 12 years old, and they were like, do that line of meth, and I was like, I don't want to, and they're like, well, you're here, kid. You're gonna do the line of meth, or we're gonna fuck you up.
So do you believe the substances are inherently evil, or is there something about being
meth is definitely 100% inherently
being
evil.
pressured to do that as a 12-year-old?
Meth is inherently evil. It will cause evil. It's never done anything good. Nobody's ever done anything good on it. Nobody's ever been like, I'm the best meth parent ever. It just doesn't fucking happen. And anybody who tells you anything else is a lie. Heroin is probably the same.
So are you comfortable? If you're not comfortable talking about what you just told me about selling drugs in Haight-Ashbury...
Oh, no, I definitely... So, statute of limitations, I will talk about anything that's outside of statute of limitations. No, I wasn't much of a criminal. In fact, I like to use the term outlaw because criminals cause harms on society. And in my youth, I did do some things that you would consider criminal, but I did them without causing harms. So I'd always considered myself an outlaw in that sense. And so I did... learn very young, at a young age, that you could find a substance that was good and cheap and you could sell it somewhere else for more.
And you sold LSD?
For instance, when we first got LSD in San Francisco, it was 50 cents a hit and we had to buy at least 1,000 at a time. So it was $500 for 1,000 hits of LSD. And we would roll around to festivals and we would sell it for $5. We were literally making 10 times our money. And I didn't ethically feel bad about that. I could never be a coke dealer or a heroin dealer or a meth dealer because I would feel I was causing harms on society. And so that's an area that I've always tried to stay in, and I'm not saying that psychedelics haven't caused harms on society, but I'm saying that they're definitely significantly better on society than things like cocaine and methamphetamine and opiates.
Circling back to the work that you do with the church right now, how do you aim to create a structure that fosters the kind of experience that can actually make people better people?
So this really is about, I'm not a super religious dude, so this really is about creating a container of space where people can utilize the mushrooms as a tool. And like I said, I have to stray away from using healthcare terms. But when you say spiritually healing, I really have seen how profound mushrooms in particular can be. And that actually leads right into one of our programs, which is our Veterans Diurnal Sacrament program. And my oldest brother, retired Sergeant Major Tom Davey, has been utilizing my mushrooms for the last 5 years. And it got him off of his government-issued PTSD medicine. And so when I saw that profound change in my brother, I realized, like, this was real, that the medicine was really helping people. And like I said, I got to stray away from using the word medicine because now we have to take a spiritual approach to doing the same thing to help people. And so one of the cool things about our veterans program is that it's going to be run by vets. My brother's going to start doing the integration circles, and it's going to be a way to help veterans empower themselves and heal the way that my brother has, and then help facilitate that in other veterans. And so remind me once again of your original question. I was getting a little astray there.
So the question I was asking was, now that you have this church, how do you want to create the kind of structure that really fosters healing experiences? And you did answer that question to some extent in terms of your veteran circles, which I do have more questions about that, but I'll let you finish the question, is how the church really makes a space where the medicine, whatever you want to call it, can actually help people be better people.
So henceforth, we will just go with referring to it as the sacrament, and not the medicine, because the sacrament is a legal spiritual term, and so yeah.
Well, it's so funny because I feel like spirituality, especially when you look at indigenous religions, there isn't always as much of a firm dividing line between a recreational experience, a medical experience, and a spiritual experience. Those are very Western distinctions, but of course you have to play by those Western distinctions when you're dealing with a legal entity. And that's actually part of where we're leaning with them. When we look at the mushrooms, oftentimes you hear this language, I took mushrooms last weekend. And we're not the type of people that take mushrooms. What we do is we commune with the mushrooms, right? And so it's more about a reciprocal relationship. And so about creating the container of space with the church, having a safe space where people can non-denominationally participate
and utilize this as a tool in the ways that a lot of indigenous and original cultures and peoples have used. It's a profound, profound experience, and I think as humans we're actually hardwired for it, where these experiences are part of our DNA. And it actually roots back to about 650 million years ago. The fungi kingdom gave birth to the animal kingdom. And I think that that's really special and profound because essentially they're our ancestors. And one of the special things about mushrooms is they grow in places where we have disturbed nature. They grow where we've chopped wood. They grow where we've done so many trails, and they're actually responding to us in a way. They're responding to our sound. They're responding to our destruction of nature. And in my mind, this is actually our great ancestors calling out to us to live in peace with nature and in harmony with nature. And so that's kind of one of the ideas that we're encompassing as we create this space, is to realize that mushrooms are our ancient ancestors that are calling out to us, and that it's on us to respond to that call. And by communing with the mushrooms, I do a lot of breath work and meditation with the mushrooms when I'm doing them, but I think sometimes the mushrooms just do the work by themselves, where someone recreationally will take them and all of a sudden they get this message that's like I need to do better. It's like you walked into grandma's house with shit all over your feet and you're like, man, I need to be a better human. And so sometimes the message is self-contained. But if you start doing things like breath work and meditation and doing ceremony, you can actually utilize these as a leaping off point, where if you do some of the work with the mushrooms, you'll get more profound results.
I think that's a really beautiful sentiment. And it reminds me, I wasn't really raised religious, but my mom is a Buddhist. She teaches Buddhism, meditation, Vipassana practice. And one of the things I grew up hearing about in the Buddhist tradition, they talk about the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And Buddha is the teacher, Dharma is the teachings, and Sangha is the community. And I really think that there's some wisdom in that framework in terms of you get the most spiritual transformation if you all have all three. You have a teacher, you have the message, and then you have
That's actually
the community.
Really profound and on point. I like it.
And I think that it sounds like, tell me if this is not quite your interpretation, but what I'm hearing is that the mushrooms are your teacher. The mushrooms are kind of also the teachings, but the teachings are a little bit more how to live a better life, how to be more spiritually in touch with yourself.
And particularly with nature.
With nature, absolutely. And, I'm going to use healing in a spiritual sense here, not a traditional medical sense, but how to be a more healed person, especially for people after going through a traumatic event like war.
Yes.
Tell me about the Sangha, the community. What stage are you in the process?
Community is literally where we're at right now. We've done everything else, and we've done the legal stuff. We've done the stuff where we have kind of what we would call our living Bible, where it's our guidelines. But these are open to, as we get together, we're a board, we're a nonprofit, so we're run by a board, right? So everything has to be approved and passed by the board. And our current guidelines are going to be like a living Bible where they can fluctuate, and we're open to new interpretations, and obviously we're still developing them.
I'm wondering, I talked to you and I talked to your friend who's also in the church, and I feel like a common theme was that both of you have, I'm not going to say disdain, but maybe disinterest in organized religion and sort of like traditional religiosity in the sense that it's widely practiced in this country.
I do for the most part, and you actually brought up Buddhism, and Buddhism is one of the things that I actually lean towards the most, because I always want to avoid being a spiritual poser. Like you see those guru dudes and they say all the right words, but they're really like kind of just spiritual posers. And so Buddhism seems very like I utilize a lot of the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Buddhist leader. He's gone now, but
my mom studied with him for years and years.
Oh, really? That's awesome and amazing.
She spent a lot of time in Plum Village.
But that dude is he hits you with it pure. There's not a bunch of mumbo jumbo. There's not a bunch of woo woo. He hits you with it pure, and so I can do that with sincerity, and I think that that's really important to be able to approach this with sincerity. And so I use meditation, and I use breath work, and I use mindfulness. And particularly some of his teachings on interconnectedness, I think, are really profound when you're in a ceremonial or spiritual setting.
Well, I think that's really, really beautiful. And that leads directly into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is how do you avoid the pitfalls, because when you're dealing, especially when you're dealing with these substances at all, but when you're dealing with it in the vulnerability of a ceremony, of any kind of religious practice, how do you avoid the sort of unhealthy spiritual dynamics of cult leader, sort of power dynamics emerging that are predatory or unhealthy?
And that's honestly something that I've realized where we want to get facilitators in to work with what's called our Sacred Communion Workshop. And it's a low dose 1 gram where we do a lot of breath work and meditation and just some guided stuff. And we've realized that sometimes you'll attract people that come out of the woodwork and they're really attracted to this idea, but you realize what they're actually looking for is power, weirdly. And I think obviously a lot of people religiously flock to areas of power. And so something that we're trying to avoid, and we want to make sure that our facilitators are trained really well, but something we want to avoid is people who just want to utilize it as a tool for their own empowerment rather than a tool to help the community.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a really good thing to keep an eye on. God, what else was I going to ask? Yeah, I think it's really cool that you have Buddhism as sort of a touchstone, and I think it's also cool that you're
something I can do with sincerity and not, I have to be sincere about it. I have to be able to stand behind it, and the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh are so straightforward and pure that I can definitely stand with those.
And they don't really require faith.
Exactly. That really does it for me. It really does.
Because I think that is one thing. I don't think faith is a bad thing to have. I've known many people who are greatly empowered by having their faith. Faith is something that appears in religious traditions around the world. And especially, you see this in conflict zones. You see people turning on their faith as this great source of solace and comfort. And yet it also is such a vehicle for people to take advantage of people.
It is, indeed.
And if you have a community that you're cultivating that doesn't require faith, then there's not going to be that person who is going to step in and say, just have faith in my way.
Indeed.
No, it's not have faith in the teaching, it's have faith in me.
That being non-denominational, that we have faith in teachings of, say, your Christianity or your Buddhist or you're doing indigenous spirituality. We believe that all of these tie into a same concept, that love is the power of manifested creation.
You mentioned working with veterans. Is that something that is just the sessions you do with veterans are just their own thing and the only people participating in the ceremony? Or is it something that it's like a mixed crowd that includes veterans?
Right now, I do actually have a write-up on we're calling it our Veterans Diurnal Sacrament Program. And that's actually, diurnal sacrament's just a word that makes daily sacrament. That's microdosing with spiritual intent.
Interesting.
And so for my brother, for him, a microdose is actually like 1/4 to 1/2 gram right now. He's a rather large dude, and he's getting the most out of that. And so the profound things that actually happened for him that I saw was he said that his nightmares went away. He said that he realizes he's safe with his family in Utah. And those were big deals because when you're post-war, you can't stop looking for the enemy. You can't turn it off. And so when he said his nightmares went away and he realized he's safe in Utah with his family, he was like, my life changed, dude. And so now it's been so empowering for him that he feels the duty to help his brothers. And as he's helped people, there's some resistance to it because of the stigma around mushrooms. And these are military dudes. They don't want to be viewed as a hippie weirdo, right? And so part of it is him approaching the stigma of getting pretty straight-laced dudes to try mushrooms for the first time.
Well, that's a crazy transformation that is happening in the last few years. It really feels like you have these high-profile veterans. I think Dan Crenshaw, the representative from Texas, I don't remember which district, I think Dan Crenshaw and AOC worked together on a psychedelic decriminalization bill because they both represent these vastly different constituencies that nonetheless are each turning to psychedelics for their own reason.
Yeah, and for some of these guys, it's the last chance. They're fed up with everything. They've tried everything they can do, And because they trust my brother, and he's like, listen, brother, this is what it did to me. It helped me. And sometimes it has to be like a literal last resort in order for them to try it. And then everyone he's got to try it now uses it instead of their government-issued PTSD medicine. And I think that that's pretty profound.
What is the government using for PTSD? What
Honestly,
is standard of care?
this is one of the things I should have taken a note on because I thought it might come up, but I don't actually have the name. But I think it's a fairly common one, and the talk is amongst a bunch of soldiers is that it's actually worse than just dealing with PTSD without it. Is somehow the medicine just makes it worse.
Is it potentially like it masks the symptoms? So, because I am a firm believer that people have natural healing capacity if they have an.
I love the question, but honestly, there's a point where I do hand the torch off to my brother to speak because I don't feel that I have the right to speak on behalf of veterans completely. And so that's one of the reasons that I got him involved, is because he can speak to those things where I can say what I heard him say, but like you'll get the honesty and integrity from him. And so I try to avoid doing that too much. And but I do love the question.
Hey, maybe sometime I could interview your brother.
That would be amazing.
Really
I think
cool.
Actually, honestly, I think that would be a great step.
That could be a part 2 to this episode.
So one of the things we're trying to do now with the Veterans Diurnal Sacrament program is we're reaching out and trying to break through that stigma of telling people he's the best messenger for it because he's the one who it really changed his life, and he's the one who can talk their language and speak directly to them as a combat soldier. And so I think it's going to be a really great program. It is literally in its infancy. We have a few members right now, and one of the things we're doing is we're reaching out to the Portland Psychedelic Society. They have a once-a-month meeting of veterans that's online, and so we've been joining that just to reach out and try to find people that we can help. And once again, this program is going to be 100% free to any church member. So if you're a veteran, you're a church member, it will be 100% free. We're just trying to help people.
I know we got a few listeners in Portland, so if you live in the greater Portland area and you're interested in becoming a church member, you can reach out to Max. I will drop a way to contact him either at the start or the end of the episode. So
awesome, thanks. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say you mentioned that there was stigma in the veteran community around using mushrooms, around using psychedelics, and obviously there's a lot of other, ibogaine is getting a lot of attention right now for traumatic brain injury and for PTSD. MDMA obviously went all the way up the FDA for PTSD. So psychedelic care for veterans is getting a lot of attention right now. Deservedly. I wonder if, as someone who is operating in Portland, you have felt there was an element of the reverse stigma, like people who are part of the church who are not veterans maybe feeling like uncomfortable, like I know personally I am able to separate. I am very critical of our military. I am very critical of our foreign wars. I am very critical of our foreign policy, but I don't hold that on veterans. People join the military for lots of reasons. They do it to pay for college. They do it because they have no other path forward in life.
People are economically forced into the military.
That's part of the way the military keeps going and our society is structured. So really, I think it is paramount importance that we take care of our veterans, but I'm wondering if you have seen any pushback within other elements of the community.
One of the biggest things is just being viewed as a weirdo. They're like, oh, he takes mushrooms. And like immediately, like, my brother lives in Utah. If you take mushrooms in Utah, you're a weirdo. Like, just socially. It's like it's something that you have to break through. And so I think that one of the weird things is that when we were in the Portland Psychedelic Society group the last time, is they were talking about ketamine therapy. And ketamine therapy's already been approved for a lot of soldiers. And it's weirdly, a lot of the soldiers are afraid to take ketamine because of the disassociation with themselves. They're scared that they could lose themselves somewhere in that disassociation. And so my brother specifically refuses the ketamine therapy and believes that the mushrooms are a way more profound way of approaching it.
That's really interesting. So all he knows about the ketamine therapy that makes him not want to do it is the fact that it's a dissociative?
He literally says, I can't go there. I can't let everything go. Like, I'm afraid to let everything go. And I told him, like, I've done ketamine before. It's actually like a vacation from yourself. And a really great experience, he still refuses to try it.
I feel like everyone I know who has done both of those says that ketamine is milder than a full dose of mushrooms. Mushrooms don't play around.
Yeah, well, and then touching on some things that have to do with neuroplasticity and brain chemistry, I think that there's really something there with the way that, say that, they've tested people that are off mushrooms and on mushrooms having to do with flow state or creativity. And so one of the things that happens when you take mushrooms is you get hypofrontality of the lobes, where parts of the brain that don't normally communicate begin communicating with each other. And I think this is where some of the breakthroughs in PTSD are occurring, when those parts of the brain begin to communicate and different things are firing off. Like, I can only speak so much to the scientificness of it, but I believe that that's part of what's going on there.
Yeah, if you look at fMRI scans of the brain on psilocybin, it is, I think it was Robin Carhart Harris who did those really famous images of this is your brain off mushrooms, and then this is all the neural pathways and the parts of the brain that are kind of connecting when you're on mushrooms. Well, if you don't mind me asking, I'd love to ask a few more questions just about the church. Sure. And about what things look like. I read the entirety of your charter, or your new member orientation, whatever you call it, and I was really struck by the way in which you emphasize things like the sacred path, intention, growth, but you also emphasize service and reciprocity and giving back to the community, and really taking the lessons of what you call the sacrament and applying them to your life. And what does that look like to you?
So I actually have a couple key terms that I did define in a few different contexts, because I figured they would come up in the conversation. And one of them is reciprocity. In fact, it's number one on the list. And so, without sounding purely verbatim written down, I just want to say that in the context of the church, reciprocity is the sacred practice of giving and receiving in balance, acknowledging the interconnected relationship between the self, the sacrament, the earth, and the divine. It is a conscious act of honoring the gifts we receive from the natural world, especially the sacrament, and offering something back in return, whether through prayer, gratitude, acts of service, or mindful intention. And so I think that reciprocity is actually a key when approaching this with the right attitude. You can't just take. You have to create a relationship of give and take. And I think that really roots down to indigenous traditions, which, while we do like to appreciate indigenous traditions, we're certainly not trying to appropriate them. But reciprocity is huge in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I know when we talk about reciprocity in terms of indigenous traditions, a huge thing that people talk about is the idea of, and this is especially true for if we're taking the medicine directly from sort of areas where there are active indigenous tribes, it's about reciprocity to those communities. It's about the issue of biopiracy. You can't be taking some other culture's hard-earned wisdom that they have cultivated over centuries and their medical practices, taking it, certainly people who are making a profit off of those, that becomes a real issue if they're not giving back to those communities. Now, you're a church. You don't. That was
actually one of the hugest deals with the original Maztec people in Oaxaca, Mexico, where back in the 1950s, Time magazine did an article on the first dude who went down.
It was Gordon Wasson.
Yeah, right? and did mushrooms, and so they actually it kind of ruined their village, where all of a sudden everyone flooded down there and they all wanted to experience this magical thing. And so one of the reasons I think that mushrooms special in that regard and is that there's certain sacred medicines like peyote that aren't really that available, and I think that they really should be reserved for their original peoples. But the beauty of mushrooms and specific psilocybin cubensis is that they're circumpolar. They grow all over the planet. There's 116 active species worldwide, and they grow where humans have disturbed the planet. And so there's actually a consensus among some of the indigenous leaders of the world, particularly Grandma Yotima, who's one of the 13 indigenous grandmothers, where they have a consensus that now is the time that mushrooms are the medicine for the people, and because they're most prolifically available, that we're actually at like a threshold of human consciousness where we either need to receive the message from nature and from our great ancestors, or we're gonna fail.
Longtime listeners of this podcast will know I did a whole peyote episode about the history of peyote with starting in a few isolated Native American tribes and then really becoming seen by the broader, as there became this sense of American Indian or a Native American community, which was really created during the genocide. There were all these different tribes and then they were all forced together, and that was how that identity emerged, and in their modern cosmology, it was seen as the Great Spirit gave them this medicine in times of need. And now, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that medicine is sacred, that medicine should be preserved for that culture.
100%.
But that we are also in a time of need. We are in this planetary moment of environmental distress, of war around the world, of potentially reaching an economic breaking point, a time with lots of division and hatred, and that mushrooms can potentially act as this planetary catalyst for us being better people worldwide.
I really believe that. I think that the message is contained within, but when you particularly do some of the work yourself, it can be a profound thing where, like I said, walking into grandma's house with shit on your shoes is a real thing. And to do that spiritually, like once you realize it, you feel ashamed. You feel like, I need to be a better person. And then it actually goes into, it's your duty to be a better person. And we actually have spiritual duties on this planet. And I think that if we shirk them and if we shy from them, we might have to come and do this stuff again. One of the things my mother taught me, she was a hippie, and it's pretty simple. She taught me that we come from a whole and we choose to be in these fleshy bodies to have experience. And then when we die, we go back to that whole. And so personally, I think about that as I just call it universal consciousness. And a lot of people call it God. I try to stray away from the word God because I think it's been abused and kind of made ugly.
It carries a lot of baggage for a lot of people.
And so when I think of that concept of universal consciousness, that thing that people refer to as God, it's actually always here with us. It's here in nature. It's here in every breath that we take. It's here in every day. And so part of the things that makes it special, and one of the things that I've been practicing a lot lately, is just the simple act of gratuity. It's huge. To be grateful to be alive every day, to breathe, to eat, to be here in this special place. It's huge.
That's such an important practice. I think having a gratitude practice is just very important. Well, what is next for Raven of the Sacred Entheogen?
So right now we're in a stage where I'm shaping all of our cornerstone programs, which is our Sacred Communion Workshop. That's the 1 gram dose where people come in and do breath work and meditation. And every time we do that, it's actually open to community criticism, where we see what the community wants and we find a way to make it better for our community.
When you say community criticism, is that people who are taking part in the ceremony criticizing?
Literally.
Or is that people who come to watch the ceremony?
Literally. Actually, so the last ceremony, we had 2 people who did not participate in the 1 gram dose, but yet sat there and did breath work and meditation with us. And I think that's totally right, and it's awesome.
I mean, that's beautiful if you want to be a
one of the people
practitioner.
that did the breath work and meditation, like, he knew his Buddhist stuff, and like he was holding it down, and so I would really like to connect with him in the future. But so as we did that, we're in our infancy here, right? And so we're listening to our community, and as we do these sacred communion workshops, we're taking in the input, and then we're reshaping the workshop towards what the community wants.
I think that's beautiful.
Other than that, I really am focusing on veterans first, because as a nonprofit, I want to help people first, and I want to show the world what we can do. But eventually we will have the same thing. We're calling it our diurnal sacrament program, and eventually it will be open to all members, right? And so it will be a microdosing program with breath work, meditation, and particularly focusing on integration.
And just since I know we'll get questions about this, right now, this is legally protected,
This is legally protected. We are a 508c1a faith-based organization. We're protected under the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act, and also several other applicable state laws. But the biggest thing that happened in this area is the Ayahuasca Church took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. And when they won, they set precedents for other churches like us. And so, like, these are the people who really blazed the trail.
Is this Santo Daime?
It is Santo Daime and the UDV.
UDV.
And the UDV,
yeah.
Yes. Yeah, those are definitely people that I wanted to give a shout out to, as, particularly the Santo Daime, the UDV, the Mazteca Oaxaca people. Our current programs that we're working on are the Sacred Communion Workshop, and then we're doing the Veterans Diurnal Sacrament Program, and eventually that'll transition into the Diurnal Sacrament Program for regular members. But future stuff, like really big stuff, is actually inspired by Tony Bossis, who he's done research that has recognized psilocybin's ability to relieve existential anxiety of fear and death. And he's done a bunch of big case studies and clinical trials at NYU. And so one of the biggest things that's happening in America right now is we don't die very well. It's prophetized, it's monetized, and it's actually like made to be kind of something to be afraid of rather than something to be celebrated. And so one of the biggest things that he's noticed is that in his clinical trials with the terminally ill cancer patients, every single one of them who had a mystical experience no longer fears death. And so I think this is a really big deal. Like, what if we did this for all adults in the final stages of your life? You don't have to be clinically ill in order to, in the final stages of your life, have this experience and maybe be less afraid of death. And so I think as a church, like, this is a long-term goal where we can do what Tony has done for his clinically ill, terminally ill cancer patients, and we can make people not afraid of their final years, kind of like almost a going away ceremony. And so, like I said, this is huge long-term goals of the church, but I think that it could be a profound thing for our community where we send people off without fear, and we send people off with love, and we do something different.
Well, I think that that's such a beautiful goal for a church to have, which is ostensibly its entire purpose is to help people understand and live in accordance with something that is beyond the scope of our small and finite lives. And I think that you accurately summed up the situation, that we have a culture that is afraid of dying. And I think all beings are probably afraid to die. I think it's natural to be afraid of death.
Unless culturally you make it a rite of passage and you make it something special to not be afraid of. Like, what are we scared of? And so one of the things that we can actually quantify that Tony's done with his clinical trials is that he's shown a huge reduction in what he quantifies as demoralization and hopelessness. And so when you're facing death and you know it's imminent, to be demoralized and hopeless is like a huge factor, right? And so his reduction was a 40% reduction in demoralization and hopelessness over the placebo in clinical trials done at NYU. And so this is a really big deal where as a church, and we're stepping in the realm of the sacred, we also approach this with a scientific approach. And I think that's one of the really cool things that we're doing is we're taking religion and science and putting them together, and they're not mutually exclusive.
No, in fact, they used to be seen as part and parcel of the same sort of curiosity. I did an episode of this podcast I called it Tasting Your Own Medicine for Science. And it was the history of scientists who took their own drugs. And if you go back before about 1800, before the Enlightenment era, which was really when science started to cleave itself off from religion, science was seen as understanding God better. And I know you don't like to use that with your church, you don't like to use God, and I have mixed
No, but I like
feelings
science in that
I know, I love it.
It's a great way
and
to do science.
I do love that you are setting this long-term goal as a church, because I've been, for years, I've been a big proponent of the availability of assisted suicide for end of life. And yet I think that comes with real problems in terms of, especially when you allow industry and any sort of
it does, but
profit
locally
seeking.
I actually seen one very good case of assisted suicide, and it was my ex-wife was a bartender at a local bar, and she had a client that was in her 80s, and she could still ski. And so she would ski every year, and it was part of her passion for life. And then one year, and I think she was about 82, she broke her hip. And when she broke her hip, she was like, I'm done. I'm cashing it in. And so she got to make the empowering choice to go out on top and threw her own funeral as a going away party. and then was able to legally leave this world. And I think that that is something that's profound and special, to be able to have that choice and to take it and grasp it as your own, and then to throw your own going away party. Could you imagine how amazing that would be?
I think that is beautiful. And I think that the only thing that scares me about that is that, I am a big critic of our capitalist structure.
So the fact that she was 82 also and had lived a fulfilling life, I don't think you should be able to do that at 45, or there should be.
Well, what if you're in debilitating pain?
There's a lot of different arguments there, and obviously I don't think I should dig too deep in that. Yeah. But there are a lot of different arguments there. But I think that 82, when you have that happen, that you should definitely have the choice there.
Well, the point that I was trying to make really is that you are a nonprofit organization. You are not charging for these services. You are not profiting off of encouraging people to do anything that is ending their life. You are providing, death is going to come for all of us. And your goal, if I understand correctly, is to provide an experience that brings you peace about it.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
One that scientifically is shown to make you not afraid to die. And I think that humans are afraid to die, and I've actually had enough psychedelic experiences. I think I'm on the cusp where I'm not afraid to face it. It doesn't make me super scared, but to be able to do that for all of our people, I think would be profound, and to be able to celebrate death rather than to be in fear of it, I think is key.
Well, did you have other things you wanted to talk about?
Let's see. I have so many notes here. I guess we didn't talk too much about the default mode network. If you want to get into that a little bit, I think that that's
connected to the ego, right?
It's a profound thing that happens when you're dealing with it's ego death. A lot of the indigenous people call it the dark night of the soul, and in a sense they refer to it as ego transcendence, not disillusion. And so I've seen people who they're like, I took the psychedelics, why didn't I experience ego death? Where was it? And so I think that it's a little bit of a different concept, where I've actually experienced ego death, and you literally do not care about that part of you. It's just it's gone, and it can be a profound experience, but I don't think people who go searching for that very seldom find it directly.
No, but I think that's a common factor you hear with a lot of these stories, is anytime you're searching for a specific experience, on some level, searching for something specific is closing yourself off to what you may find. Going in with an open mind is how you're going to get the best and most profound experience.
It is indeed, but it's hard to make that like stepping into a clean laboratory room of going in with an open mind. We're just humans, so there's a lot of gray areas there.
Have you explored, you talk about integration, you talk about integrating
Yes.
the experience. Have you explored what that means if people are living lives that maybe they have something very real in their external environment that is making them unhappy? Obviously, psychedelics have tremendous benefit for people who, for whatever reason, they have something is off with their brain chemistry. What if someone has normal brain chemistry and they live in a life where maybe they're a felon and they have no job prospects? Maybe they have deep shame about something they did in war. People have a lot of reasons why they might be legitimate reasons to be unhappy or unfulfilled. And have you encountered that in your ceremonial work, and how do you support people?
My gosh, that is such a good in-depth question to throw me on the fly. I might have to attack that with a little bit of thought, because that is such a deep, profound question that I'm going to write that one down and think about it, dude.
Well, Max, I will have you on the podcast again. This will be Raven of the Sacred Entheogen Part 1.
Let's do it. This has been an amazing time.
Thank you so much for coming on. I am so grateful that you took time out of your day. I want to learn so much more about the church. I would love to come to I don't know if I'm going to come to a ceremony, but I'd love to at least get involved more, be a part of my community. So
thank you so much, Sky. I do want to emphasize that this is definitely all in its infancy, and I am the forever student. I'm always trying to learn. I'm always trying to be better and do better, and to take in knowledge from the community and incorporate that. And in closing, I just want to once again gratuity is one of the deepest things in our church, and so I want to express gratuity for you having me here today, and much love, brother.
Much love right back at you, or much love, I should probably say.
Much love indeed.
As they say on Arrowhead and Shroomery.
Much love.
And that concludes our conversation with Max from Raven of the Sacred Entheogen. Thank you all so much for tuning in. As always, if you enjoyed what you heard, give us a follow on x.com, the Everything app. My Twitter handle over there is drugculturespod. You can give the show a follow at consciousness_cultures on Instagram, or shoot me an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com. If you have any questions, think I got anything wrong, or have an idea for an episode or guest you'd like to hear from in the future, I am always all ears. Much love, everyone.